My girlfriend chose my wealthy roommate over me because I shopped at thrift stores. She didn't know I'd already put a ring in her jewelry box worth more than his car. Sophia called me at 4:12 p.m. on a Friday, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. She'd found the ring, the 4-carat diamond I'd hidden in her vintage jewelry box 3 months ago, nestled beneath the Art Nouveau earrings she'd collected from Brooklyn flea markets, and the delicate silver chains bought with coffee shop tips. The custom platinum setting held stones from my grandmother's private collection, each diamond selected by the same jeweler who'd created pieces for the Astors and Vanderbilts. The ring was worth $180,000, more than Blake's leased Lamborghini, more than most people earned in 4 years, more than the trust fund payments Blake received monthly from his family's construction empire. The appraisal certificate had fluttered from the jewelry box when it fell from her dresser, the impact triggering a hidden compartment I'd discovered during the restoration process. Blake had been standing beside her when she'd opened the velvet ring box with trembling fingers. His knowledge of luxury goods extended to designer labels and exotic cars, not fine jewelry or precious stones. He'd suggested it might be cubic zirconia, maybe a sweet gesture from her tech support ex-boyfriend who shopped at thrift stores. The certified appraisal from Cartier had silenced his dismissive laughter immediately, the number written in elegant script burning itself into both their consciousnesses. I'd purchased the ring 6 months ago, commissioning the setting from Henri Dubois, the same Parisian jeweler who'd created my grandmother's engagement ring in 1952. The stones came from Eleanor Blackwood's private collection, diamonds she'd acquired throughout 7 decades of passionate art patronage and cultural involvement. Each stone carried history, provenance, stories of artists supported and institutions built through generations of family wealth. The jewelry box itself had been a birthday surprise, a 1920s Art Deco piece discovered at a Westchester estate sale. Sophia had fallen in love with its geometric silver inlays and tiny beveled mirror, never knowing it once belonged to silent film actress Vivian Cross, whose personal effects had been scattered across auction houses after her death. Sophia kept her most treasured accessories inside, vintage pieces that connected her to different artistic movements and historical periods, but she rarely opened the box anymore. Since Blake moved into our Tribeca loft 8 months ago, she'd been borrowing jewelry from his sister Charlotte instead. Cartier tennis bracelets and Tiffany pearl necklaces photographed better for Instagram than her carefully curated vintage collection. Her bohemian aesthetic had evolved into borrowed luxury, authentic personal style replaced by designer accessories that impressed her new social circle. I'd needed a roommate to help justify the loft's astronomical rent without raising questions about my actual financial situation. Through mutual friends at Columbia, I'd connected with Blake Hamilton, whose trust fund provided monthly payments that exceeded most people's salaries. He'd arrived with Louis Vuitton luggage and Porsche keys, radiating the effortless wealth that impressed everyone except those who actually understood money. Blake had dropped out of business school after 1 semester, claiming entrepreneurial success required real-world experience rather than classroom theory. His current venture involved launching a cryptocurrency platform for art investment, though he'd never purchased a single piece and demonstrated zero understanding of blockchain technology, market dynamics, or art valuation principles. The apartment had been too large for one person, too expensive for most graduate students, but I'd wanted space for Sophia's art studio. She'd been working from her cramped Brooklyn apartment, barely enough room for easels and supplies, let alone the large canvases her artistic vision demanded. The Tribeca loft offered natural light, high ceilings, space for her to create without constraints. Sophia had been immediately drawn to Blake's confidence, his apparent financial security, his claimed connections to gallery owners and collectors throughout Manhattan. She'd started questioning my lifestyle choices, wondering why I shopped at vintage stores when I clearly earned decent money as a software engineer, why I drove a 15-year-old Subaru instead of something that matched our expensive address, why I seemed content living below what she assumed were my means. The transformation had been gradual, but unmistakable. Sophia began accompanying Blake to gallery openings, art fair previews, dinner parties with supposed collectors and curators. She'd started critiquing my appearance, suggesting I needed better clothes for professional events, expressing embarrassment about my thrift store aesthetic when meeting her artistic peers. I'd continued my deliberately modest lifestyle, shopping at Housing Works for vintage band shirts, taking the subway to my nonprofit job developing educational software. The work provided intellectual satisfaction and steady income, but nothing glamorous enough to impress Sophia's increasingly sophisticated social ambitions. The breaking point came during Blake's dinner party 2 months ago. He'd invited gallery contacts to view Sophia's work displayed throughout our apartment, promising her exposure to influential collectors and critics. She'd spent weeks preparing new pieces specifically for the evening, researching each guest's background and preferences, styling herself in her most elegant vintage ensemble. But Blake's guests had been politely dismissive of her artistic credentials. They'd made vague comments about emerging talent while clearly remaining unimpressed by her portfolio, exhibition history, or sales record. The conversation had moved quickly past her work to discuss market trends and investment opportunities in established contemporary artists. I'd watched from across the room in my usual thrifted flannel and jeans, carrying wine glasses and trying to remain invisible among the designer-dressed crowd. Sophia had shot me increasingly frustrated looks as guests mistook me for catering staff or building maintenance. My casual appearance had embarrassed her in front of people whose professional opinions could influence her career trajectory. After the guests departed, Sophia had unleashed months of accumulated frustration. She'd accused me of sabotaging her professional opportunities by appearing like someone who couldn't afford gallery opening admission fees. Real artists needed partners who understood image presentation, who could open doors instead of hiding in backgrounds wearing clothes from thrift stores. The next morning, I'd discovered them sharing intimate coffee conversation in our kitchen, their discussion stopping abruptly when I appeared. Sophia wore Blake's Columbia sweatshirt, her hair tousled in ways that suggested overnight intimacy. She'd avoided direct eye contact while explaining they'd discussed art market strategies until dawn, their creative collaboration extending well past appropriate boundaries. Blake had smirked behind his expensive coffee mug, clearly enjoying the relationship tension he'd systematically created through months of calculated charm and financial peacocking. He'd positioned himself as Sophia's artistic savior, promising investments and connections that would launch her career into contemporary art prominence. Over the following weeks, I'd watched Sophia gravitating deeper into Blake's social orbit. She'd accompanied him to VIP gallery previews, exclusive collector dinners, art fair openings restricted to industry professionals. He'd promised to fund her first solo exhibition, introduce her to influential critics whose reviews could establish her reputation, invest substantial money in her artistic development. Meanwhile, the gap between my apparent modest means and Blake's flashy wealth had grown more pronounced in Sophia's perception. She'd become increasingly critical of my satisfaction with what appeared to be mediocrity, my lack of visible ambition, my indifference to social status and professional networking opportunities. The morning she'd announced her decision to move out, Sophia had delivered her reasoning with brutal clarity. She needed someone who could support her artistic dreams practically, who understood that contemporary art careers required substantial financial investment and industry connections. Blake offered both resources, plus the sophisticated lifestyle she'd always envisioned for herself. Our relationship had been emotionally fulfilling, she'd explained, but professionally limiting. I'd held her back from reaching her potential through my apparent contentment with modest circumstances. Blake represented advancement opportunities I seemingly couldn't provide, access to collectors and curators who could transform her artistic career. She'd packed methodically over several days, folding vintage dresses into protective boxes, wrapping paintings in specialized materials, gathering art supplies from every corner of the loft where her creative presence had made our space feel alive and purposeful. The jewelry box had remained on her dresser throughout the packing process, but she'd never opened it to retrieve accessories for her new life. Instead, she'd worn diamond jewelry borrowed from Charlotte Hamilton, pieces that sparkled impressively in natural light as she carried boxes downstairs to Blake's waiting Lamborghini. The contrast between her borrowed luxury and my thrift store aesthetic had perfectly illustrated the gap she'd perceived between our respective financial capabilities. I'd helped her pack without protest, maintaining dignity even as our shared history was systematically erased from the apartment. Each removed item had felt like evidence of our relationship being deleted from existence. The professional easel I'd bought for her birthday, the expensive oil paints I'd surprised her with after her first gallery inclusion, the art history books we'd collected during weekend explorations of used bookstores throughout Brooklyn and Manhattan. The goodbye had been awkward but civil, both of us understanding that fundamental incompatibilities had made separation inevitable. Sophia had thanked me for supporting her artistic journey during its early stages, for believing in her talent when she'd doubted her abilities. She'd hoped we could eventually maintain friendship, that I'd understand her decision stemmed from career necessity, rather than personal rejection. I'd watched from the loft windows as Blake's car disappeared into Manhattan traffic, carrying Sophia toward what she'd believed was a more promising future. The apartment had felt hollow immediately, creative energy absent, surrounded by empty spaces where her paintings and supplies had brought life and color to sterile luxury. 3 days of profound silence followed her departure. Her abandoned studio space haunted the loft, easels turned toward walls, brushes soaking in turpentine jars, canvases stretched and primed for projects that would never be completed in our shared space. I'd processed the relationship's end while surrounded by physical reminders of our former creative collaboration. Then came her desperate phone call, voice cracking with discovered truth and dawning realization. The jewelry box had fallen while she'd packed her final belongings from Blake's apartment, the impact revealing both the hidden ring and everything she'd catastrophically misunderstood about my actual financial situation versus my chosen lifestyle presentation. The ring had led her down research paths that exposed my true background through publicly available estate records. Eleanor Blackwood had died 18 months earlier, her obituary listing a single grandson as primary beneficiary of one of North America's most significant private art collections. $50 million in artwork spanning 4 centuries, from Renaissance masters to contemporary installations displayed in major museums worldwide. Sophia had spent sleepless hours reading auction catalogs, museum loan agreements, insurance appraisals, documenting pieces she'd never suspected I owned. Paintings featured in art history textbooks, sculptures coveted by collectors internationally, rare works that institutions requested for special exhibitions. My grandmother had been a legendary cultural patron, using early technology investment profits to acquire masterpieces throughout her lifetime. The inheritance had included far more than artwork. Stock portfolios, real estate holdings, investment accounts had created financial freedom that eliminated any necessity for traditional employment income. I'd continued working because I'd enjoyed intellectual challenges and collaborative environments, finding purpose in educational software development that helped students access learning opportunities regardless of economic background. But I'd also used inherited wealth strategically, funding organizations and causes aligned with my personal values. The Columbia University Art Scholarship Program had been my creation, supporting talented students who lacked financial resources for supplies, tuition, and basic living expenses. Sophia had been a recipient without knowing it, her education funded by anonymous donations when family support had disappeared during her junior year. The Meridian Contemporary Arts Exhibition had represented another secret investment. Curator Elena Vasquez had received anonymous funding specifically earmarked for emerging artist showcases, with selections based purely on artistic merit rather than commercial viability or personal connections. Sophia's upcoming solo show had been scheduled because her work had genuinely impressed Elena, not because of any special influence or behind-the-scenes manipulation. I'd been systematically building opportunities for Sophia's career advancement while allowing her to maintain independence and authentic achievement. Her coffee shop job had been financially unnecessary for months, but I'd never suggested she quit because I'd wanted her to preserve self-reliance and personal accomplishment rather than becoming dependent on my resources. I'd believed that genuine talent and dedicated work would eventually create sustainable success, that authentic artistic achievement mattered more than financial shortcuts or purchased opportunities. My philosophy had emphasized character development and creative integrity over material advancement and social status recognition. When Sophia had requested an emergency meeting, her voice had been barely recognizable through tears and hyperventilation. She'd alternated between desperate apologies and confused accusations, expressing gratitude while demanding explanations for what she'd perceived as deliberate deception about my financial capabilities and relationship intentions. We'd met at a neutral Soho cafe, away from locations associated with our shared history or current living situations. She'd arrived wearing borrowed designer clothes, her appearance carefully constructed to project success and sophistication despite her internal emotional devastation. Her hands had trembled visibly as she'd placed the ring box on our table between coffee cups. She'd begun with accusations about emotional manipulation, claiming I'd deliberately withheld crucial information that would have influenced her major life decisions. If she'd understood my actual wealth, she could have made informed choices about our relationship's future potential. Instead, she'd been forced to evaluate our compatibility based on incomplete and misleading information. I'd explained my philosophy about authentic personal connections, about finding someone who valued character and compatibility over financial security and social advancement. Too many relationships had been corrupted by economic inequality, with partners choosing stability over genuine affection, security over emotional intimacy. I'd wanted Sophia to select me based on who I was as a person, my values and character traits, not what I possessed as inherited assets or potential provider capabilities. The wealth had always been intended as something we'd share together after marriage, but I'd needed confidence that her commitment stemmed from love rather than financial calculation. She'd cried then, admitting her growing attraction to Blake's apparent wealth while attempting to rationalize it as strategic career planning. The contemporary art world operated through connections and financial influence, she'd reasoned, making practical considerations more important than romantic idealism when choosing life partners. She'd selected what had appeared to be financial stability and professional opportunity over what had seemed like limitation and ongoing struggle. But the ring's discovery had revealed how completely she'd misunderstood the actual situation, how devastating her calculations had proven when based on false information. Our conversation had continued past cafe closing time, management allowing us to remain while we dissected relationship dynamics and decision-making processes that had led to such fundamental misunderstandings. Sophia had described her growing frustration with my apparent contentment with modest living, my indifference to social status, my lack of visible ambition or career advancement. She'd wanted a partner who could match her artistic aspirations with financial capability, someone who understood that creative careers required substantial investment and professional networking support. Blake had appeared to offer both resources while I'd seemed satisfied with comfortable mediocrity. As evening had approached, additional revelations had emerged about Blake's actual financial situation versus his carefully maintained public image. His family's construction business had been leveraged far beyond sustainable limits, dependent on market conditions that had shifted dramatically over recent months. The trust fund supporting his lifestyle had been borrowed against future inheritance that might never materialize given mounting business debts. Blake's claimed art world connections had proven to be superficial social acquaintances who tolerated his presence at gallery events, but possessed no real influence or professional authority. His cryptocurrency venture had existed only as an elaborate website and business plan, with no actual technology development, investor funding, or viable market strategy. The promised investment in Sophia's career had been revealed as complete fiction when his substantial check had bounced spectacularly, insufficient funds for even a fraction of the amount he'd written. The gallery space he'd claimed to be securing for her solo exhibition had been unavailable for rent, already occupied by another artist with a 2-year lease agreement. Meanwhile, my grandmother's art collection had been generating daily opportunities for cultural involvement and professional advancement. Museum curators had regularly contacted me about potential exhibitions. Academic institutions had requested educational loans. Auction houses had made inquiries about selected sales for their upcoming seasons. I'd recently been offered positions on multiple prestigious cultural boards, advisory roles that could have provided exactly the art world connections and influence Sophia had desperately sought through her relationship with Blake. The Metropolitan Museum, Whitney Contemporary, Guggenheim Foundation had all extended invitations based on my family's historical contributions and personal commitment to supporting emerging artists. The irony had been complete and devastating in its implications. She'd abandoned someone who could have provided everything she'd wanted for someone who could offer nothing beyond convincing illusions and empty promises. Her supposedly practical decision had been based on entirely inaccurate information, leading to consequences that honest communication might have prevented entirely. By the time we'd finished our extended conversation, Sophia had asked directly about reconciliation possibilities, whether we could rebuild what had been damaged by misunderstandings and poor judgment. I told her honestly that I needed substantial time to process everything, to determine whether fundamental trust could be restored after such profound betrayal of my character and our relationship foundation. She'd returned to Blake's apartment that evening, but their relationship dynamic had deteriorated rapidly as financial realities had become impossible to ignore. Her discovery of his elaborate deceptions had coincided with mounting pressure from creditors, landlords, and family members who'd finally recognized the unsustainable nature of his lifestyle choices. Within 2 weeks, Blake had been forced to abandon his expensive Manhattan apartment, return his leased luxury vehicles, and face harsh realities about his actual financial situation versus his projected public image. His family's construction business had filed for bankruptcy protection, eliminating his access to the trust fund that had supported years of elaborate lifestyle maintenance. Sophia had found herself simultaneously homeless and heartbroken, having destroyed her stable relationship for promises that had evaporated under the most basic scrutiny. She'd been forced to move back to her cramped Brooklyn apartment, resume her coffee shop shifts, return to the artistic and financial struggles she'd thought she was permanently escaping through strategic relationship choices. I'd received periodic updates through mutual friends about her attempts to rebuild both her personal life and professional career. She'd applied desperately for gallery positions, submitted work to juried exhibitions throughout the city, attempted to recreate the opportunities she'd abandoned without understanding their true source. 4 months after our breakup, I'd received a formal invitation to join the Metropolitan Museum's board of directors, recognizing my family's generations of cultural contributions and my personal commitment to supporting emerging artists and educational access. At 26, I'd become the youngest board member in the institution's distinguished history. The appointment had received coverage in major art publications, including photographs from the museum's annual gala, where I'd worn a custom tuxedo while surrounded by collectors, curators, and cultural leaders Sophia had once desperately hoped to meet through Blake's non-existent connections. She'd learned about my new position through social media coverage, seeing images of opportunities she'd rejected. The final devastating irony had emerged when Elena Vasquez had contacted me about the Meridian Gallery exhibition. She'd assumed that my silence following Sophia's departure indicated dissatisfaction with her curatorial selection, leading her to remove Sophia's work from the upcoming show and replace it with another emerging artist who better represented the program's values and standards. Sophia had lost her exhibition opportunity, along with her financial security, her relationship with both Blake and myself, and her chance to enter the art world through authentic merit rather than false connections and empty promises. Her practical decision had systematically destroyed every aspect of the life she'd been attempting to improve and advance. I'd kept the ring, returning it to my grandmother's collection where it belonged among family pieces spanning multiple generations. Sometimes I'd wondered about alternative scenarios involving complete financial transparency from our relationship's beginning, but mostly I'd felt grateful that Sophia's true character and priorities had been revealed before we'd made permanent commitments based on fundamental misunderstandings. 6 months later, I'd quietly begun dating again, meeting women through museum events and cultural organizations where shared interests and values could develop naturally. I'd been more direct about my background while still emphasizing the importance of genuine connection over financial compatibility. The experience with Sophia had taught me that complete honesty was necessary for authentic relationships, even when that honesty complicated initial attraction dynamics. The ring had ultimately served its intended purpose perfectly, just not in the way I'd originally planned. It had revealed everything we'd needed to understand about each other's character, values, and relationship priorities, providing crucial information that had prevented a marriage built on false assumptions and incompatible life philosophies. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.